It is my great pleasure and honor to be here, especially to help celebrate the Feast of Mary, Help of Christians, Our Lady of China, and Our Lady of Shashan. I have worked in China for about 40 years and try to do a little bit, at least, to help the growth of the church in China, but also to understand the overall religious context in which the church has to live. So today I will talk mostly about the religious and political context, and then a few words about how I see the Catholic Church developing in the present time. So China today is undergoing a remarkable religious renaissance, which includes not only revival and reinvention of many traditional forms of Chinese religions, but also the creation and creative adaptation of new forms. Literally, millions of local deity temples have been built or rebuilt in the past 30 years. Pilgrims flock to refurbished Buddhist temples and Taoist shrines, and multiple forms of Christianity have been undergoing explosive growth. This is all the more surprising because during the era of Mao Zedong, Chinese leaders tried to suppress all forms of religious practice. And during the Cultural Revolution, they actively tried to obliterate religion from the face of China. But since 1979, when Deng Xiaoping issued in an era of reform and opening that opened up a limited space for religious practice, religion of all sorts has been growing and rapidly evolving throughout China, far surpassing the limited boundaries set for it. Although it is obvious enough that there is a religious resurgence in China, it is hard to come by accurate survey data on it because religion remains a sensitive topic for the Chinese government. A survey published in an officially approved journal by the East China Normal University estimates that there are at least 300 million religious believers. But even that is too low because it attempts to count only believers who are affiliated with some kind of recognized religious association. If we look at the sum total of religious practices, such as praying, burning incense on festival days, having an image of some deity at home, sweeping tombs of one's ancestors on the Qingming festival, going on pilgrimage to a sacred site, practicing meditation, counseling feng shui masters, then according to the sociologist Yang Fenggang, about 85% of the population could be considered religious to some degree. Even about half of self-identified atheists hold some religious beliefs, such as believing in supernatural forces, heaven, hell, or reincarnation. How did all of this survive the vigorous attempts of an atheist Chinese government to eradicate it? One reason was that the Chinese version of Marxist ideology was too thin to substitute for the multiple dimensions of Chinese culture. Throughout the centuries, that culture has sustained an enormous variety of ways of thinking and ways of life. Yet all of this great variety takes place within a common cultural framework that recognizes the interpenetration of different kinds of reality. In addition to the space-time of everyday life, there is another space constituted by a transfigured geography, organized with references to places where heaven meets earth, and another time marked to this day by the traditional lunar calendar, which sets the framework for community celebration, worship, and prayer. both Marxist communism and capitalist consumerism attempt to flatten out this multidimensionality, and both fail. The interaction between the two forms of space and time constitutes a social ecology in which, as the sinologists Vincent Gossart and David Palmer write, religious elements are in perpetual relation with other elements, and in which the components and boundaries of the religious field are constantly contested. This is a fluid realm, driven by constant creative imagination in the face of ever-changing circumstances. As the Taoists suggest, this multidimensional culture persists like a current of water, swirling around the hard-edged realities of daily life even as it engulfs them. The flattened official ideology fails in the first place when confronted with the realities of death. A social worker who works with elderly in Shanghai told me that many of her clients use religious language when they talk about dying. Many people, she says, are using religion to understand difficulties in life, whether Buddhism, Christianity, or popular religion. Faith is important. You know, she said, I'm a party member, and we don't have religious beliefs, but I respect people who do, and I see the importance. One suspects that when she is retired and old and sick, her sense of the importance of spirituality may overcome the party ideology she now has to officially profess. I also know a member of China's elite whose father was a famous revolutionary general. When her father died, her grief-stricken mother went to the Buddhist temple every day for a month to pray for him. The Marxist ideology fails too when confronted with the vicissitudes of faith. Much in modern Chinese life feels arbitrary. A poor person becomes rich through a stroke of luck, being in the right place at the right time. A rich person can be suddenly toppled because of a sudden shift in the government's tolerance of corruption. Temples of all kinds are full of people petitioning for good fortune, and indeed, fortune tellers do a brisk business. The one-dimensional ideology even fails to find answers to questions of meaning and justice that it has created itself. For an older generation, the disasters inflicted by a revolution conducted in the name of Marxist, Leninist, Maoist ideology raised concerns within the Red Guard generation that, as one dissident put it, reached the level of ultimate concerns. As he said, they must find a rational explanation for the days of their youth, days when they muddled through unconsciously, for that life made abnormal by fanaticism, by passion, naivete, blindness, frankness, and dedication. We must settle accounts with ourselves. Meanwhile, younger generations are becoming vocally concerned about the moral emptiness of the anxious, relentless competition for money and power under the new socialist market economy. The moral emptiness thus leads to a quest for moral integrity that the superficial Marxist-Leninist ideology fails to provide. Having reached middle-aged, many businessmen who have gained success through the debauched entertainment with wine and women that has become a standard practice for developing guanxi are now becoming worried about their physical and mental health and are attending Buddhist and Taoist retreats to cleanse themselves. Parents send their children to Confucian schools to learn moral lessons from the classics. The lessons are even updated to fit modern realities. For example, one of the new prescriptions given to young children for exercising filial piety is that the children should help their elderly parents learn how to surf the internet. And the quest for moral integrity is also leading many people into Christian churches. Catholicism, as well as other forms of Christianity, is an integral part of the Chinese social ecology, and it asserts its identity either in contrast to or in resonance with other parts of it. Thus, although an important part of traditional popular religion was and is the worship of a large number of deities, different ones in different times and places, and Chinese Catholics denied the existence of these deities, many of them nonetheless pray to saints and spirits in ways similar in some ways to the practice of non-Christian neighbors. To this day, a vital form of Chinese religious practice is veneration of the ancestors through sweeping their tombs on the festival of Qingming. And even when Catholics do not participate in this festival, their venerations during All Saints and All Souls days show the same respect toward their forebears. Much of Chinese religion was based on the sense that the cosmos was enchanted, that powerful sacred forces lay beneath the surface and can be invoked through proper rituals for good and bad. More than many Christians in the modern West, Chinese Christians of all types, including Catholics, pay much attention to signs and wonders, miracles and apparitions and portentous dreams, and they go on pilgrimages to sacred places like Shoshan, where miraculous healings and apparitions of the Virgin Mary have taken place. Another reason for Chinese religion's survival and renaissance has been its embeddedness. It is not so much set apart from the world in separate institutions that are vulnerable to assaults from a dominant government, but as the great sociologist C.K. Yang put it, it is diffused within the fabric of family and community life. Chinese religion is thus communal. Temples are not merely places of worship, but true community centers, a local nexus of power, commerce, education, and culture. For Catholic communities, local churches are often the same. A common pattern in rural Catholic communities, where for historical reasons the Catholic Church has been the strongest, is that a whole village or a whole family lineage within a village will be Catholic. The faith is handed down from parents to children and is intertwined with all aspects of local community life. Even so-called lukewarm Catholics who don't go to church regularly will not be able to give up their Catholic faith because at the very least they will have to be buried as a Catholic, because otherwise there would be no way to become connected to their ancestors. This communal embeddedness has been a source of creative innovation as well as resistance to hostile outside forces. As Chinese social ecology changes, all forms of religious practice, including Catholic Christianity, continuously change and adapt. The era of reform and opening after 1979 loosened the bonds that once held local communities together and brought new opportunities for mobility within China and connection with the outside world. Forms of religious practice that were once hidden within communities or even within individual hearts could now find public expression. But even as that happened, the communities that had sustained these practices began to evaporate, slowly at first, but now accelerating. Rural villages have become hollowed out as the young and middle-aged leave to work in the cities. At the same time, new forms of communication provide opportunities for more expansive personal relationships, but also for new forms of government surveillance and control. New temples get built with wealth generated by the new economy, but the temples are often empty much of the year until migrant workers return for the major festivals. Meanwhile, various religious masters promote new forms of practice through the internet. As I myself discovered from conversations with members of the Communist Party's United Front Department, it is obvious even to knowledgeable officials that the theoretical foundation for the official religious policy does not work. The official Marxist theory holds that the advance of modernization will steadily bring about a secular, a-religious society. But as party members tasked with providing guidance for religious policy, as they themselves admitted, they are imprisoned by that ideology, which has become a sort of infallible part of the party's dogma. The actual policy that the party ends up creating, therefore, is an incoherent mixture of ad hoc measures. Nonetheless, a certain form of synthesis, full of ironies and contradictions, seems to be emerging. It draws more from the Qing emperors Kangxi and Qianlong than from Marx and Lenin. Those emperors combined the roles of king and pope and had the prerogative for deciding which religious teachings were true or false. The emperors based a decision on their assessment of what forms of practice were likely to support their rule and what forms to oppose it. As noted in an influential paper by Zhuo Xinping, the head of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Institute of World Religions, the basic principle in the past was that the government is the master, religion the follower. Today, the government's determination is based mostly on those traditional practices that religious believers carry out, but the content of the belief also matters. The religious beliefs of an imagined Han Chinese great tradition, Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, are considered better than foreign religions, quote unquote, with global connections like Christianity, Islam, and Tibetan Buddhism. As it appeals to nationalism to shore up a legitimacy that Marxist-Leninism cannot provide, the government today is encouraging various forms of Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, even as it scrutinizes their practitioners for tendencies that could be subversive. And it tries to stifle the rich cultural diversity that these forms once subsumed. The government seems to hope that what it considers proper forms of the traditions will inhibit the rise of potentially dangerous forms like Christianity, which combine religious practices it considers dangerous. Toward such practices, it applies the full power of a coercive apparatus developed by Lenin and perfected by Stalin and Mao. How does the Catholic Church fit into this? Despite or even because of the way political authorities, emperors in the 18th century, and Communist Party leaders in the 20th century have tried to suppress hierarchies and ministerial hierarchies of all forms of Christianity, there has been a continuous indigenization of Catholicism from below. Since Catholicism was embedded in local community life, communities carried on their faith even when clergy were absent, and under lay leadership, they have adapted themselves to local social ecologies. Now, of course, there has been a reconstitution of the church hierarchy, but a split within the hierarchy between those officially registered and under the auspices of the government-controlled Catholic Patriotic Association and those who are unregistered. These fractures give rise to dissent and conflict among different Catholic communities. There are ongoing negotiations, as you know, between the Vatican and Chinese political and religious leaders to heal the fractures in a way that could satisfy both the Chinese government and the church. Other speakers here can discuss this in greater detail. I would rather focus on the local forms of local religious life within the changing social ecology. There is now a greater harmonization of Catholic practice. Before, when local communities, isolated and bereft of clergy, were left to their own devices, the Catholic world was like a quilt of many colors. There was a wide array of local devotions supported by local stories, handed down by word of mouth from previous generations. a reflection of the wonderful diversity sustained by the multidimensional matrix of Chinese culture. Now, because of the greater ease of communication made possible by rapid economic development, local Catholics are more than ever aware of how their counterparts in other parts of China are living their faith, and they're aware of developments in the universal church, such as the Second Vatican Council. Also, the reconstituted hierarchy, however fractured, can now give much more formal and informal direction to grassroots Catholic communities than during the Maoist era. As a result, the variegated patchwork of local practices has blended into varying shades of gray. There are sociological as well as theological reasons for the different shades. Operating with official approval, the officially registered part of the Church is in more regular communication with global Catholic trends arising from the Second Vatican Council. Many of its leading priests and bishops have received seminary training in Europe and North America, where they study theology that places greater emphasis on the role of laity as the people of God and encourages the laity to adapt their faith to the modern world, including giving greater tolerance to fellow citizens who hold different faiths and ethical viewpoints. The Vatican II documents also give a greater role to the bishops' conferences to maintain the affairs of their national churches. Such modern theology can be congenial to a government that wants Catholics to be more independent of direction from the Vatican and more open to cooperation with non-Christians, even communists. Furthermore, it helps justify government demands that local communities democratically elect their own leaders. Most Catholics, even those who worship in the official church, see through the government's sham evocations of democracy, and they do not want to modernize the faith if it means adapting to an increasingly corrupt society. But different factions in any organization usually differentiate themselves by emphasizing the mutual contrasts. Sometimes, therefore, the unregistered underground parts of the church may be drawn to the darker shades of gray, more militantly closed to outside influences, which may fit the need of a beleaguered community to hang on to a strong moral anchor. But tensions thus arising among communities and between communities in the state can inhibit the creative imagination needed to adapt to the rapid transformations of an overarching Chinese social ecology. Chinese society was about 80% rural in 1980, but it is less than 50% rural now, and the pace of urbanization will only increase in the coming decades. Bishop Aloysius Jinlu Shen, the late Bishop of Shanghai, said, "To tell the truth, I had no fear for our Catholics facing persecution. But now, facing the challenge of modernization, of pure materialism, the idolatry of money, of individualism, I have fears. How to teach the Catholics to live the gospel? How should we ourselves live the gospel in the quickly changing China?" The problem, I would suggest, is not simply materialism, but the disintegration of large Catholic families attuned to the rhythm of agriculture that were the matrix of the Catholic faith for generations. Because of conflicts among communities, in the face of the rigidities of state control, the Catholic Church in the People's Republic of China has had difficulty developing theological and pastoral adaptations to the new urbanism. But cultural China is bigger than the mainland of the People's Republic. In the different social ecologies of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, the interplay between religion and social life is different, and so is the place of the Catholic Church within these dynamic frameworks. Hong Kong is a city of immigrants connected through open networks throughout Asia and around the world. The Church there has been less embedded in static communities and more open to global trends. Since Vatican II, the Hong Kong Justice and Peace Commission has been a vigorous source of prophetic outreach toward marginalized peoples, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, throughout Asia. While aiming to be a bridge with the church in the mainland, the Hong Kong Church is also engaged with local Hong Kong forces that are critical of the mainland and want to resist its pressure. Meanwhile, the church in Macau was historically rather insular and passive, confined mostly to descendants of Portuguese colonialists. But it has recently been engaging with issues around family life that have been brought to the fore by the entertainment industry that now dominates Macau. Finally, partly because the church in Taiwan was perceived to be identified with immigrant mainlanders in the 1950s, it lost considerable membership with the rise of a Taiwanese nationalism, and perhaps also because of slowness in responding to the aspirations of a rising educated middle class. Thus, through all the areas of the Chinese world, although they all share the same basic Chinese culture, differences in their political, social, and economic dimensions lead to different local Catholic theologies to be heard, practiced, and institutionalized in different ways. Global Catholicism is being localized differently in the different localities of the Chinese world. In the name of the so-called Chinese dream of a great renaissance of the Chinese people, China's leader Xi Jinping wants to unite the entire society, eventually including, of course, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, under a common culture, a blend of homogenized traditional values and Marxist ideology under the control of a unitary state. He wants Christianity to be sinicized, as he puts it, into this culture. But this is, I believe, a superficial, one-dimensional, religiously unified culture that would only superficially encompass the dynamic diversity of multidimensional Chinese lives and would keep the Chinese people, certainly including Chinese Catholics, from creatively adapting to the challenges of a dynamic social ecology. Like a persistent current, the forces of indigenous creativity and diversity, I believe, will in the end prevail.